Hello, I'm Pat McCormick, and welcome to Cambridge Broadband Matters, a CCTV series that explores the relationship among people, public institutions, nonprofit organizations, businesses, and broadband in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This series serves as an educational and community engagement companion to broadband planning and action already underway in Cambridge. With us today is Christopher Mitchell, Director of the Community Broadband Networks Initiative at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in Minneapolis and Policy Director for Next Century Cities. For 10 years, Chris has focused on what communities can do locally to make sure that they have the high-quality internet access needed for modern commerce and a high quality of life. Christopher's work focuses on telecommunications, helping communities ensure the networks upon which they depend are accountable to the community. He is a leading national expert on community broadband networks and speaks at conferences across the U.S. on the subject, occasionally to directly debate opponents of public ownership. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. So I thought we could start off by just telling us a little bit more about the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in Next Century Cities.
Sure. There are two separate organizations. The Institute for Local Self-Reliance was founded more than 40 years ago. It's actually older than I am. And for the past 10 years, we've had a program focused on internet access. Broadly, we focus on local economy and political, basically, decision-making. We basically want communities to be able to make their decisions locally rather than having to be dependent on Washington, D.C. or very big corporations. The other programs at the Institute focus on like local businesses and energy and a variety of other things. Several years ago, Next Century Cities was actually created out of many mayors and local leaders that wanted to see more local solutions and defending local solutions across the country. Now there's more than 160 communities that are on board, mostly cities, a few large counties, and they are working together. They share ideas, they share what works, they work together to try and defeat anything that might get in the way of local solutions. So it's really an exciting group to be a part of, and frankly, this is an incredibly exciting time for local governments in general and communities to take action.
Great. One question that often comes up with people talking about broadband is whether the infrastructure we currently have today in our communities have the capacity to support not only what's happening today, but what's coming tomorrow in terms of economic development and educational opportunities and so on. Could you kind of summarize your view on where we're at in terms of that future proofing?
Sure. I think it's hard to summarize because there's so many different needs from, different residents on the same block will have different needs based on their, level of tech enthusiasm. Businesses have different needs. Schools and libraries have different needs. But I think, for a community like Cambridge, it's not enough to just have the same sort of infrastructure that you have in most cities, which is what Cambridge seems to have right now. You're relying largely on a cable system. Comcast has a history of investing in the modern cable systems. So there's other cable companies that would not be as good as what you have. But there's a lot of communities around the country and also the world, which I think when you have these incredible institutions and businesses that you have in Cambridge, you're not just focused on the country, of course. But you need to be globally competitive, and you also want to be nationally competitive. When I went to Chattanooga after they launched their network, a few years after they launched their network, which brought a gigabit to everyone, I met people that had decided that they wanted to launch their next great application in Chattanooga rather than San Francisco or the Bay Area. They found that the connectivity was better, the cost of living was lower, there was a variety of things that it had going for it. I think when you have the kind of institutions you have here, you want to make sure you can support them well. And I'm afraid that the cable infrastructure we have won't do that. And I would say that the number one concern is probably upload speeds. I'm a Comcast customer in my home. It's the only real choice I have. So, I definitely have a lot of experience with them, and I would not take anything away from their professionalism. But their upload speeds are pretty limiting for local businesses, for people that just want to be very creative. And so that's one deficiency I would identify.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, Cambridge has been looking at broadband options. I would say that there's a level of interest in the residential and business community. But nothing's been decided at this point. A number of different models have been looked at and studied. What would you describe in terms of different options, particularly this idea where communities like you mentioned, Chattanooga, have decided to do their own thing, whether it's a public-private partnership or a municipal network or a community network? What are the types of community networks and benefits with that sort of approach?
Well, there's a lot of different models because there's so many different communities around the United States. There's 450 that we're tracking, and we know that there's some that we haven't found yet, where the local government is making some level of wired access available to local businesses and or residents. About 150 of those communities go citywide where anyone can take service. So that's kind of the ballpark. And there's common models, but frankly, when you get out further into that curve, of the different approaches, you see that there's a lot of different things that you could do. And the first thing that I want to make sure a local government considers and a community realizes is that you don't have a binary choice. It's not a choice between doing nothing and investing tens of millions or $100 million or more, depending on the size of the community. There's actually a variety of choices because we have a different time horizon in which we want to do it. If you want to take the ultimate Cadillac, most expensive option, that would be for the local government to borrow as much money as it would take to roll out a fiber network over a few years to everyone. And that's something that a number of communities have done to varying degrees of success. Chattanooga's been wildly successful. Most communities have been successful, and a few have struggled with that model. Frankly, it's the highest risk model. Other communities have taken a longer approach where they put a little bit of money in over multiple years and they expand out. So you might build fiber down Massachusetts Avenue. You might build it down major arterials in 1 year, and then you connect to some of the people that are really enthusiastic about it. And then in the next year you might expand upon that. And you get in the game slowly. And that's the sort of thing that I generally recommend communities do when they're not sure that they have the ambition to go all in. Because I think it's really important to recognize, Cambridge has been thinking about this for several years. People have thought about this, I'm sure, 10 years ago in Cambridge, right? So even longer than that. And if they had been doing a little bit each year, which is totally reasonable, especially as streets are opened up, there's different construction projects and things like that, you would have an incredible asset at this point from just those 10 years of small investments. So my number one message is generally figure out something that will make sense, figure out a discrete project that could be built upon and get going with that. And I do think that a lot of the communities that try to figure out how to do it all at once, they end up spending many years doing nothing, and I worry that they may just not get around to doing something.
Yep, sure. And I know some of the projects I've been involved in, there often is that interest in an incremental phased approach, but it can be difficult, right, to identify the milestones where each level of investment pays off. What do you think of some models across the U.S. where that's been working, or particularly creative approaches that you think we can learn from?
Yes, I think, in some ways, I would say it's easier now to get started than it was several years ago, because historically we believed that you had to offer television service. Let me say that a little differently, which is to say, historically, you had to offer television service. Right. We were correct in that, assumption. Now it is more clear that you don't have to offer television service in order to make these networks pay for themselves, which is nice because that incredibly high fixed cost of offering a television service is incredibly high cost up front, and so you want to spread it across as many people as possible. If you're just going to deliver high quality internet access, that's actually something you can bite off a little bit at a time. It's more modular, I'd say. And so the question then would be, does the city want to offer service, or is there an ISP or multiple ISPs you'd be willing to work with? In my experience, most local governments, most communities more broadly, they don't necessarily want the local government to be a service provider. But in many cases, they will actually end up doing it because they cannot find a local partner to work with. Generally, the big companies are unwilling to. Even the regional companies are unwilling to in many cases. They don't want to try new business models. They certainly don't want to put at risk their historic model that has worked for them. And then in other cases, you have just a dearth of local ISPs, because even though 20 years ago we had many of these ISPs flowering, I would say a combination of federal decision making that really discriminated against small providers, and the market power of the big cable and telephone companies really ran most of those companies out of business. And even though those people might still be around, for many of them, they don't trust government. I think another lesson is to, if you don't have a lot of confidence that you really want to just go in and try to compete toe-to-toe with an entrenched incumbent provider like a big cable or telephone company, sliding into it with some incremental investments is a good start. And in particular, a lot of communities will start by serving anchor institutions, your police, your schools, your libraries with fiber, because you know that they're going to be around for a long time. And often you'll find that it actually cuts their telecom budgets with more reliable service if it already wasn't coming from a municipal fiber network. And then you can try and expand that to businesses or residents in neighborhoods that are the most enthusiastic about it. So you can kind of grow a little bit organically. Now, I think one of the dangers of doing that is that you can leave behind low-income populations. And that's something that community broadband, more broadly, we really don't want to do. We don't want to replicate a model that is only for middle income and higher income folks, because this is too important for the education of low-income folks, of kids that are growing up in working class households, that sort of thing. So you want to, I think, be deliberate about how to expand it. Some places have launched $10 a month offerings in public housing, for instance, to make sure that people can have a high quality connection. Now, there are some private sector programs that are $10 a month, but often it's not as high quality internet access. So even though kids will be able to access the internet, they may not have all the advantages of other children in the area. So I think there's a balance between the goals you set for yourself in terms of, well, we would like the network to pay for itself entirely, and we want to make sure that low-income people aren't left behind. Well, sometimes that's not possible, or it requires a much longer time horizon. So I think you have to wrestle honestly with this. Is our goal to connect job sites and to bring in, programming high-tech jobs? Is our goal to make sure we're serving low-income folks in a way that their needs aren't being met currently? Those can be mutually exclusive depending on how you want to go about it. So I think, you really have to make those sorts of decisions and wrestle with that.
Right, right. It seems that one challenge of a kind of a phased approach is that if you're trying to achieve something equitable across the city, as you said, inevitably you're doing something in one place and not the other. And you're probably also engaging with private providers that previously would not come to the table, would not improve their service, and maybe they do improve their service, which of course could be a good outcome. But it really complicates things, doesn't it, in terms of the changing environment that a community or a municipal network is operating in, and the so-called take rate. How many people can they expect to participate? Are there examples that you can think of or best practices to try to cope with those challenges? Well,
I think one of the most important things is not to expect that people are just going to run over to join your network. You can expect that 10, 15, 20%, maybe more in a community like this are going to jump on it because it's local, because they want their money to stay in the community rather than leaving the community, which is truer of large corporations in general. So sometimes people who are doing this, they have more of a community focus, and they don't realize a lot of people in the community are just focused on getting by. Nobody wants to stay home from work to switch their internet provider over. A lot of people are using an email address that's tied to their ISP, so they may not want to switch over. So one has to be very engaged, make sure people understand the value proposition of this network, make sure that it's actually has a good marketing plan to get in front of people's faces and motivate them to make that switch. Because otherwise, people will stick with the existing providers. And frankly, that can be a win, because if their bills go down, they will have more money in their pockets. They will spend more of that likely, in Main Street and things like that in the community. But if your network is trying to break even without using any taxpayer subsidies, which is the norm for these kinds of investments, is to not subsidize them with taxpayer dollars unless something goes horribly wrong, then you need to make sure you get enough subscribers to pay for it. But let me just say that taxpayer dollars shouldn't be off the table necessarily. Some communities will decide that this is basic infrastructure and they need to use taxpayer dollars. In Madison and Wisconsin, they're building out to low-income neighborhoods deliberately. They're not expecting the network to pay for itself. They just view this as something that's really important to make sure people have a high-quality connection that's available. In other places, like in Louisiana, in particular, Lafayette has a successful fiber network that's really achieved a lot of the goals they set out for it. And yet, they would never subsidize it with taxpayer dollars. They would actually sell it before they would subsidize it. So I think different communities will respond to this in different ways. In Leverett, Massachusetts, here in out west of here, they raise their property taxes a little bit to pay for it. There's other communities that are toying with that, and a few have done that. So there's more options that are coming on the table. And I'll just say that I don't want to spend the rest of the time talking about taxpayer dollars, but taxpayer dollars may be the best way to make sure low-income folks are connected. And I think you can do this in ways, and we've seen people do this in ways that you make a one-time investment. So, you have a capital expenditure of, let's just say $1 million. Then you never subsidize that network again, because the high cost of building the network is in the physical pieces of it. So the actual offering of the service is relatively inexpensive. You can do a one-time subsidy and then have a network run forever in the black, which I think is important because decision makers shouldn't be hemmed in by previous decisions. You don't want a city council to say, we're going to stop subsidizing this network and it's going to get shut off. So if you structure it in this way, you can actually really have a tremendous investment that will continue to operate.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned public support for whether it's a tax-funded network or some other approach. Sometimes depends on whether it's interpreted as infrastructure or some might say utility versus a kind of a service that the market provides. And I think you also mentioned that that's about equity and whether everybody has access to the same kind of service at the same price. Do you see any trends, as far as that goes? It seems that many people have many different opinions about broadband and internet access and what exactly it is.
Well, the trend line is undoubtedly that more people consider it essential. Now, the term utility, I think, is a little bit of a trap in that different utilities are treated differently, and the issue around network neutrality turned into a discussion about whether or not internet was a utility. And for people who aren't familiar with this, let's just say that it's a lot of policy and there's a lot of assumptions as to what it means to be a utility. In my mind, I think the question would boil down more broadly to, should everyone have access to it at some level? Or should private companies basically decide who has access under what terms? I actually favor both in some sense, which is to say that I don't think we should have a public monopoly. I don't think a municipal monopoly or a state or federal monopoly is good policy. I like that there's private investment out there, that there's private companies that are doing this. I also think it makes sense for local government to do it and to compete. And I think that when you look at competition between government and companies, some people get pretty nervous and they assume government's always going to have the advantage. I can tell you, if Cambridge was to go into competition with Comcast would have almost all of the advantages. They're a massive company. They have massive economies of scale. They have all the subscribers to start with. Cambridge would not be able to engage in an anti-competitive manner due to state and federal law. So I wouldn't worry about it running them out of business. If we saw a tendency over 10 or 20 years that local governments were running competition out of business, I'd be concerned and certainly be for policy to make sure that we still have that choice. Fundamentally, I don't think the private sector is going to deliver choice in this area in a meaningful way, and so I think if local governments can do it, that's good. If local governments can do it in a way that leads to even more choices by opening the network to multiple ISPs, if they're willing to do that, that's also good. I don't think it should be forced on local governments. I think local governments have different situations. So it gets very complicated into all this, but I think fundamentally the nature of the internet is that we want overlapping networks. We don't want to have one network. We want to have different kinds of networks that people are using in different ways that are owned by different entities. So it's very decentralized, and we don't have a situation in which with AT&T back 50 years ago with a monopoly that had some negative results, but also not the future we're heading to right now, where fundamentally I'm afraid Comcast is kind of re-centralizing the internet in ways that are harmful.
Right. Now, you also just mentioned state laws, which really do vary state to state. To what extent is it challenging for municipal or community projects to understand what they can do given different state laws?
Well, there's about 20 states that limit access, limit the ability of local governments to get involved. If people are interested, we often tend to refer to this as local internet choice. The ability of local governments to be able to decide if they can make investments, whether that be a retail type service or investing in infrastructure that could be available to multiple ISPs. Different states regulate that in different ways. I'm glad to say Massachusetts does not really have any barriers. There is a process local governments can go through to establish networks. But even in states that have limits, and some of them are incredibly onerous, it's important to recognize there are often still things local governments can do. And one of my favorite examples to talk about is Lincoln, Nebraska. Lincoln is in Nebraska, which is one of the most restrictive states for just odd reasons that we don't need to get into. But basically, Lincoln can't really do anything. And so they engage in what the person who came up with it calls leasing air, which is to say they actually put conduit under the ground and they lease it to different providers. Because they've created this really valuable asset around the city, they have been able to strike deals with providers, and they're getting a lot of investment in new networks that have extensive public benefits attached to them. So I would say that one of the things that we are lacking is enthusiasm. And I think local governments need to be pushed by people who are saying, you know what, I've been waiting for better internet for 10 years now, for 15 years, for 20 years, for people like me that were on it very early on. It's too much. We need to do something. We're tired of waiting for the private sector to just sort this out. And we've lost faith that the private sector on its own could sort this out.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned the state laws and how you can deal with those in different ways depending on the context. What are the other barriers, or what are the risks that people in the community or municipal officials might focus on?
Well, I think one risk is that a business plan wouldn't work out. Some of the communities that built networks in the late 90s, early 2000s struggled financially. And they're often used as examples for why cities should not get into this. That's because they were building at a time of a major technological changeover from coaxial cable networks, the coaxial cable technology, and a fiber optic technology. Fiber optics was very expensive at that time, but some communities were starting to do it, recognizing that it offered unlimited potential to upgrade. The communities that built the coaxial networks, they struggled a bit, and they didn't get the customers they needed. And when they were competing with a big cable company, they were offering often the same technology. So that was a challenge and led to their business plans not working out. So there's a financial risk for some of these models. Now, the nice thing about fiber to the home when you're competing with cable is that you can offer a technologically superior product. So even though, as I said earlier, a big cable provider might have all the advantages in the marketplace, you actually still have one technological advantage. You can advertise very high rates of speed, your reliability will likely be better, and you can market around that as well as customer service. But I think one of the biggest concerns has to be the economics of it, making sure the economics of it make sense, and I think making sure that it doesn't require ongoing subsidies. I'm often perceived as being pretty far off to the left, which I actually don't think is accurate. I'm very fiscally conservative in the sense that I think any program that requires escalating government payments over time is probably poorly designed, and we need to find a better way of trying to do that so it's more responsible. But then I would say that in terms of thinking about concerns, the next thing, make sure you have good marketing. A lot of the communities that have done this with utilities hire their good people from within the utility to do different aspects of this new job. And marketing is something you want to hire someone that goes against utility culture, someone who might break utility rules, frankly. Right. I mean, there was a guy I talked to who was very successful at this, and I sort of asked him to describe his job. And he said, my job is running through walls. Because every time he wants to do something, his management will say, no, you can't do that. We don't do that as a utility. And he would say, well, I need to do this. And ultimately, most of the businesses in that region that were served by that network were taking service from that utility because that utility was finding ways of constantly meeting their needs. And one of those things, I'll just say from a marketing perspective that most local governments don't have to do, is reevaluating your marketing strategy regularly. Utilities might reevaluate it on a quarterly or biannual basis, right? You need to be reanalyzing these programs regularly. So if you're in the market, you need to act like you're in the market.
Yeah. Now, we could do a whole show on this topic of policy and a new administration in Washington, but just wondering briefly, in as much as a changing federal communications commission and different views on things like net neutrality, do you see that as having any impact on community and municipal broadband in the near future?
Well, I think it will have impacts on communities, and I think it may have impacts on municipal broadband separately. And I want to be somewhat deliberate about this because we were strong supporters of the FCC effort several years ago, 2 years ago, that said it was going to nullify some state laws that were preventing local internet choice, which we believed was something Congress had given the FCC the power to do. The Sixth Circuit ultimately disagreed after the FCC did take action. And so it is very clear now that if the FCC's authority is limited in terms of its ability to tell states what to do with their policy around their subdivisions of local governments and things like that. In some ways, that loss is a little bit of a firewall, which frankly is comforting now, although I would have liked to have had the ability to have local governments at an increasing level, and particularly in North Carolina and Tennessee, where these actions took place. It would have been great to win that case. But the FCC will have to go to great lengths in order to try and harm municipal broadband, unless there's something that none of us have thought of. There's always a danger of that. I do not expect them to do that in the near term, because even though many of the people that are at the head of the FCC now and the people that that the chairmen are going to listen to are very anti-municipal network, I don't think it's going to be a high enough priority for them to go after. Frankly, not enough cities are doing this to really justify that kind of effort, I think. Now, Congress could do that. But here again, you have an interesting situation in that the Republican Party is a little bit schizophrenic about municipal networks. The vast majority of cities that have built municipal networks vote Republican. They voted, and I'm not just talking about 2016, we're talking about 2008, 2012, where we looked at presidential years. And on the local level, they want to be able to make that decision locally. At the state and federal level, Republicans, the further you get away from the community, the more Republicans tend to side with Comcast, AT&T, the big companies. And I'm wondering if that's going to change somewhat, because every new community that builds a network, there's a constituency that's going to be upset if either a representative or a senator from Kansas, let's say, decides to try and crack down on that network. So I don't know that there's going to be a lot of effort to try and do anything that would be very significant. Now, there might be a middle-of-the-night effort to try and deny the ability to use tax-exempt bonds to finance some of this. And that would be harmful, but I don't think it would stop cities. And so, the other direction that I want to just mention is that every step that the new FCC takes to give the big cable and telephone companies more power to act in ways that I would call anti-consumer. We're talking about bandwidth caps, the ability to treat some content differently than others on the internet. Right. All of that is going to drive the desire for people to have alternatives. They're going to want to have more choices. And so in some ways, I think the FCC will create a backlash that could lead to more local efforts to establish some kind of local network that would be responsive to local business and residential needs. And let me just, I think it's really important to recognize, a lot of the cities that do this, they don't do it because they're thinking, you know what would be great? Let's get into the internet business. They do it because local businesses say, you need to do something because I cannot be competitive in my industry, whether that's a shopkeeper, whether that's a small manufacturer, whether that's any kind of business today almost certainly requires this kind of connectivity. They're the ones going to their elected leaders and saying, you need to do something. Right. I mean, these are capitalists that are calling on the city to take action. This isn't some movement of socialists that's slowly taking over America, I wouldn't say. Right. Although, then we get into this whole discussion about what that means.
Right. Chris, another challenge for community and municipal broadband you mentioned earlier that television is not as big a challenge as it used to be. People are cutting the cord, they're using Netflix and iTunes, and even sports are finally becoming available on the internet. But for community media and television like CCTV here, there's a real question about what place will community media have in this emerging change. In fact, already community media is being threatened by declining cable revenues as people select just internet only. And do you have ideas, or have you seen communities that as they look to build community and municipal networks, they're also looking to fill that gap and provide a community TV and media service?
There is some hope on the horizon, but I want to just note that this is a very serious problem, and it actually would be true even if internet wasn't cutting into this in the sense of people cutting the cord, because increased competition lowers the rates that are charged, and because a lot of the centers are funded by a percentage, that then harms revenues. So I think it's a problem that is going to hit us one way or another. One of the hopes that I see is that local governments are sometimes, not always, that are investing in these networks are explicitly funding these kinds of programming. There's some that engage in not just your average, government and public programming, but also local sports programming, which really they in some ways they separate themselves from the incumbent carrier by trying to go above and beyond with their own channels to cover like talk shows around local sports. I'm thinking in particular of actually, oddly enough, a private company is doing this in Winona, Minnesota. And there's co-ops and municipalities that I've run into over the years that are working with local community media centers basically to try and make sure this content's created, organized, that there's an opportunity for people to learn these skills. And to some extent, I think it falls in with larger digital divide, digital inclusion strategies, because I think we want people to learn how to both use the internet but also to create content, and that's where a lot of these centers are really important. I think fundamentally, we don't have a good solution, though. We need communities to step up, and they really need to demand that there's a solution, because local government funds can be fungible. And so if a municipal network is making money off of its fiber, there's a question of where that's going. And I think you can make a strong case that it should be supporting these kinds of centers.
Great. And do you have suggestions for viewers that might be interested in learning more about community broadband and these kinds of projects?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance has a website, ilsr.org for Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Next Century Cities has a website. We also have a website just devoted at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance on municipal networks, muninetworks.org. As I was flying out here, I actually was just reading 2 new reports from the Berkman Klein Center here in Cambridge talking about this. They do really good reporting, particularly what's going on in Massachusetts around it. And then there's the Open Technology Institute at New America, which is another organization you can look into. So there's a lot of good places. There's also a lot of misinformation, and to some extent, people should exercise their ability to research critically, I would say, whether I wrote it or whether someone else did.
Well, Chris, I just want to thank you for your time and all your insights. It's great to hear your perspective on what's coming up next for community and municipal broadband. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you, Cambridge, for taking action on this.
All right. Thank you.